This week's house study, we take on the question of the Sabbath. What does it mean and how do we live it? As ever, Mark deals with the subject very briefly, but he tells a controversial story. He records the saying of Jesus and then notes an affirmation about Jesus. And our reading comes from Mark chapter 2, verses 23 to 28. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath.'" If you read Deuteronomy chapter 23, it says that grain may be plucked from a neighbour's field as a provision for the poor, so there's nothing wrong with what the disciples were doing. But then the Jewish oral law at the time of Jesus then restricted 39 kinds of labour on the Sabbath, and the activity of Jesus and his disciples was a violation of that oral law. Now, as a rabbi and as a teacher, Jesus was expected to have a high regard for the Sabbath and its place in Jewish life. So in the eyes of the religious leaders, Jesus was despising a sacred trust and leading his followers away from one of the pillars of their faith. However, as so often is the case, Jesus saw things rather differently. So how do we live the Sabbath out? The creation story itself forms a foundation for the emphasis on a day of worship, and Jesus doesn't break that here, because the Sabbath should actually honour God and yet benefit human beings. There's nothing wrong with actually eating on the Sabbath and picking the corn. So the Sabbath isn't an excuse for excessive Sabbath keeping, but what we should really be aiming for is joyful worship, quiet reflection, quality interaction with others, and some personal time with God. Therefore, we should love the Lord's Day and look forward to the real opportunities there are for deeply satisfying human experiences. I think when we look at the world today, so often that's not what happens on Sunday, and we could ask ourselves, how do we express the Sabbath today? I'm not sure we should go back to the ways of the world in the past that it was lived out, but we might better do better than we do at the present. One can put an aside in here about the text itself. The reference to Abiathar the high priest seems to be inaccurate when you compare that with 1 Samuel 21 and 22, where a different high priest is named. And there's absolutely no simple way of dealing with this factual difference. It could be an error by Jesus, an error, in fact, by the transmission to Mark. Peter could have got it wrong in his sermons, or just a copyist error as the Bible was handed down. We might prefer the last one because it keeps the Bible accurate and historic. And we don't like the first two if we believe that Jesus made no errors, or that the Bible contains no errors at all. But we might consider, what did Jesus becoming a human being mean? Did he ever make an error when he learned his trade as a carpenter? Did he ever fail to measure twice and cut once? And perhaps did he repeat things in his teaching that he'd been told as a child inaccurately? So incarnation, one might think, is not perfection at the level we require it to be. That's something where different people have different opinions, but none of them get in the way of the reality of Jesus' life, death and resurrection, and get in the way of faith. And perhaps we shouldn't knock the Pharisees too much. They were mired in tradition, but Jesus didn't attack the fact that they were keeping the Sabbath or a day of worship and rest. We would all benefit from honouring the Lord's Day more and abstaining from all but the most necessary work and ministry. And even churches might consider whether their day of worship is in the spirit of the Bible, where they demand hours of activity from leaders and members on the Lord's Day. Jesus' point here is that gathering food is an act of necessity, even of mercy, to the needs of human beings. Above all, we need to avoid legalism. To restrict the gathering of food on the Sabbath is to go beyond the purpose of Sabbath and slip right into legalism. And legalism becomes a competition to see who can be the most obedient and the most spiritual, when God intended simple and worshipful honouring of his commandment in a spirit of awe and love. And of course, modern Christianity can rival the Pharisees at their worst in this regard. So the command to pray becomes who can pray the most and the longest and the most eloquently. The command to read and obey the law becomes who can own the trendiest Bible, or perhaps these days the best app. The command to worship and sing becomes a mad competition to see which church can be the most entertaining, unusual, and perhaps have the longest worship time and the biggest and best band, or indeed the biggest and best organist. So be careful before you condemn the Pharisees. And for us this Tuesday, might say that Jesus is a living picture of the law of God. This is the one who said, "Do not think that I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." Mark shows us that the meaning that Jesus gives to the Sabbath is a freedom from legalism, a sense of the heart of God for human beings and a vision of the Lord Jesus, who is and is above the Sabbath. May our lives be full of the reality of Jesus and free from the empty religion that separates human beings from God, others, and even our best selves.